joy and a great privilege to be here as co-sponsors to this panel today. It's a panel that is very much in keeping with what we try to do at the center. I brought my glasses up just in case expediency triumphs over vanity, but I will try to read my notes without them first. The Center for the Humanities focuses on initiating conversations on the humanities, conversations that take place within the university and across the metropolitan area of Southeast Florida. And I think the panel today captures the flavor of exactly what we try to do. It demonstrates a range of perspectives. It shows how many different people in Miami have a great deal to say from different perspectives on ideas relating to the humanities. And it shows how broad the humanities are. They're not simply 4 or 5 disciplines that exist in isolation at universities, but their attitudes, there are ways of seeing the world that touch us in almost every activity that we undertake during the day, from deciding whether or not a Super Bowl commercial is stupid or enjoyable, to how I'm going to treat the person who is competing for the same parking spot in the blue garage, to almost any decision, any way I see the world. And the more we understand the humanities, particularly in a forum like this that makes us aware that there's no single way to see them, the more we understand the humanities, the greater we understand and the greater we appreciate the world in which we live. It's a tremendous pleasure to be associated with the Cuban Research Institute that has done so much in its existence here at Florida International University to make us aware of issues not just relating to Cuba, but relating to all of us. And through a range of speakers, a range of events, it reminds us how important the different attitudes and the different communities that contribute to our life in Miami have become. So I just want to close by thanking Dr. Jorge Duane for allowing us to be part of this wonderful panel, and thanking the panelists for participating in it, and hoping that you enjoyed it as much as I know I'm going to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for your kind words and also for your co-sponsorship of this panel discussion. We've been having several events like this one in which we collaborate with other FIU units, including the Center for the Humanities and Urban University. I'm happy to welcome you all, and my role here is to introduce our guest speakers and to monitor the discussion afterwards. I'll be as brief as I can, but I will introduce each of the speakers now and then ask them to take the floor. First, we'll have Dr. Philip Carter, who's an assistant professor of English and Linguistics here at FIU. Dr. Carter earned his PhD from Duke University in Linguistics. He is a sociolinguist and scholar of language and culture in U.S. Latino communities. His scholarship addresses a wide range of issues, including the relationship between social formations and linguistic variations, Spanish language change in the U.S., the maintenance and shift of Spanish in the U.S., and particularly here in Miami, and popular discourses about language. He has written a number of book chapters and papers in leading international journals such as the Journal of Sociolinguistics, English Worldwide, Language and Society, and Language and Linguistic Compass. His book, Languages of the World, from Culture, History, and Evolution, was published last year, I believe, and provides a broad look at non-linguistic conditions affecting human language. The second speaker will be Dr. Iraida Lopez, who is a professor of Spanish and Hispanic literatures and Latino and Latin American studies at Ramapo College in New Jersey. She is the author of the book Impossible Returns, Narratives of the Cuban Diaspora, published last year, which we'll have the pleasure of presenting tomorrow at Books and Books at 2 p.m. I think there's a flyer out there if you're interested. And also the award-winning La Autografía Hispana Contemporánea de los Estados Unidos a través del Calidoscopio, published in 2001. She was in charge of the critical editions of Ana Lucía Portela's Anthology del Viejo, El Asesino, Yo y Otros Cuentos, and and Portela's novel Cien Botellas en una Pared, published in 2010. She's a recipient of awards from the Latin American Studies Association, Latino Studies Section, and the International Association of Hispanic Feminine Literature and Culture. She has also contributed to several volumes of Cuban and Latino literature. Following speaker will be Ana Menendez, who was born in Los Angeles, daughter of a Cuban exiles. She is the author of 4 books of fiction. In Cuba was a German Shepherd, which was a 2001 New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and whose title story won a Pushcart Prize. Another book called Loving Che in 2004, The Last War, 2009, and this one was chosen by Publishers Weekly as one of the top 100 books of the year. And the 4th book is titled Adios, Happy Homeland. Since 1991, Ana Menendez has worked as a journalist in the U.S. and abroad, most recently as a prize-winning columnist for the Miami Herald. As a reporter, she has written about Cuba, Haiti, Kashmir, Afghanistan, and India, where she studied for several years. She has a BA in English from FIU and an MFA from New York University, a former Fulbright scholar in Egypt. She now lives in Miami. Our next presenter will be Elizabeth Cerejido, a Miami-based independent curator whose research interests include modern and contemporary Latino and Latin American art and photography, with an emphasis on Cuban and Cuban-American art, both identity and cultural politics. She holds an MA in Latin American Studies and is currently pursuing a PhD in art history at the University of Florida in Gainesville. She is the former assistant curator of Latin American and Latino art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and also was a curator here at the Frost Art Museum several years ago. As a photographer, Cerejido has had several gallery and museum exhibitions, including at the Art and Culture Center of Hollywood. She's currently directing the Artistic Exchange project titled Dialogue in Cuban Art, funded by the Nye Foundation, which involves bringing together Cuban and Cuban-American artists in Miami. Our final presenter will be Eva Sidor Bravo, who is a PhD candidate and teaching assistant in the Department of Modern Languages and Literature at the University of Miami. She also holds an MA in International Studies from FIU and a BA in International Relations from the University of Havana. Eva's current research areas include Cuban music in the diaspora, Latin American literature and cultural studies, and she's also an independent blogger, journalist, and arts advocate. Her dissertation entitled Reimagining Humanidad, Transnational and Alternative Spaces in Contemporary Cuban Cultural Production, explores new cultural narratives as a response to the 1990s crisis from a diaspora network of Cuban music production, and also including authors belonging to the more recent generations of Varieties. Eva is the author of several book chapters and articles and websites such as Encuentro.com, and she has also presented papers in academic conferences from the Modern Language Association, the American Studies Association, and the University. So without further ado, I will ask you to hear our first panelist, Dr. Clark.
Okay, thank you, Jorge, for having me on the panel. I'm a very proud member of the Cuban Research Institute. I'm a very proud scholar of Miami. My work is for you. This is what I do. I came here to study language in Miami. I'm very happy to do that. Can we connect the sound? Let's see if it works. I want to do 2 things. We only have 15 minutes each, so I'm going to move really, really fast, and you can ask me questions at the end. What I want to do in this talk is cover 2 areas. I want to talk to you about what you know very well because you live in this community. I want to talk to you about the language varieties and linguistic structures used by Cuban-Americans. So those of you who are Cuban and born in Miami, I'm going to be talking about your language and language varieties. I need to find a place where I'm not standing in front of the projector. And then I want to spend the bulk of the time talking about the ways that Cuban-Americans talk about language, because this is very, very interesting and relates to a lot of the conversations we're having in Miami right now about language policy, bilingual education, and so on. Okay, so let's start with the first piece of it. I want to start by saying that Cuban-American youth languages, just a word on that. Cuban-Americans, let's just say this, Miami is a linguistically rich city, okay? We've got so much language going on here. In addition to English and Spanish, we have these things. Regional and social dialects of Cuban Spanish, okay, that sometimes vary by generation and sometimes vary according to how much English people speak. We have what I'm calling Cuban-American Spanish unique to South Florida that may bear the influence, the structural influence of English. We have South Florida Spanglish, okay, so a unique variety of mixing the languages. Thank you. Okay, and then also a unique variety of English spoken by Miami-born Latinos that my research colleagues and I have been calling Miami English. So, yeah, you know that? You know about Miami English? Yeah, you speak it, right? Okay, so Spanish among the Miami-born. I just want to quickly point to the literature on this topic to say that here's a couple of quotations. Spanish is extremely prominent in public life in all of South Florida, and its prestige is high. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. We can talk about that. Yet Hispanic children in Miami show strong signs of rejecting Spanish in circumstances where they have a choice to speak either language. I think that part's really true. Okay, we can talk about that also. Ortega Garcia and Roca say the intergenerational maintenance of productive ability in Spanish, especially of full Spanish literacy, is difficult to achieve. That's something that we definitely see in South Florida, and it poses all kinds of problems for us when, say, for instance, FIU college grads want to go in the job market and get jobs that require literacy skills in Spanish. Do you see what I mean? So all of that is on the table here. Bilingualism in Miami, some more quotes from the literature. Zura, Pearson, and McGee say, signs of Spanish being replaced by English to a significant degree among Miami Hispanics. And we've got good data on this. This is not just, I'm not just making it up, okay, so it's been quantified. The last thing, Portes and Schauffer, they say, Spanish language loss. Nevertheless, the data indicate that Cuban and other Latin American origin youth in South Florida are mostly bilingual. So when we consider bilingualism along a continuum, yeah, lots of people are bilingual, but we also have to ask the question, do they have access to literacy skills and so forth in Spanish? So that's what we're talking about. Let me pivot to Miami English. This has been the bulk of my work for the past 5 years at FIU. I describe Miami English as a recognizable dialect of English that has emerged in South Florida among Miami-born Latinos, Latinas, including Cuban-Americans during the past half-century. Like all language varieties, Miami English is patterned, systematically structured, rule-governed according to its own logics, like any other language variety that you could possibly encounter in the world. It has its own phonological and grammatical rules and so forth. The overwhelming majority of its features, grammatical features, sounds, and so on, are shared with all other varieties of English that you find in the English-speaking world. However, there are some unique, distinctive features, and those features have been parodied in these types of YouTube videos. Many of you have probably seen this video. Stuff will be super polite. Stuff Miami girls say, and then there was Stuff Miami girls say part 2. So people are aware that in Miami we got some unique English going on, okay? So hopefully this will play. This is a clip of Maria. One of the things when we interview Miamians, Miami-born Cubans, about their language, they say, you know, I didn't really know that I spoke differently until I went wherever. Sometimes it's crossing the border with Broward County. Okay, hey, I went to Broward and they started asking me what country I come from, and I say, Miami, U.S. Okay, and here's Maria. This is a pseudonym. Talking about her experience with that. You can also hear some good Miami English here.
I thought I spoke English perfectly before, like when I was like 14, and then I traveled to Tennessee for the first time, yeah, like when I was like,
Sorry, you're missing the best part. Is there tech support?
Yeah.
Okay, I think you get the idea. We'll just keep moving on. That's Maria, and she at the end she says, how can you tell? There's going to be other sound files, so hopefully this will work. She says, how can you tell that I'm from Miami? What do you mean? Your accent is like so strong. I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, it's like really, really strong. And I'm like, then in Miami everybody speaks the same. Where like everybody I associate myself with, they speak the same. So what I want to say about Maria, this notion of like in Miami, everybody speaks the same. What Maria is, she's right and she's wrong. What she's pointing at with that notion of everybody speaks the same is that we do have a speech community. Okay, we have a speech community and we have our own norms for speaking. Okay, and so she's recognized that in Miami we've created our own speech community and people recognize that. So you can tell if somebody's from here or not from here, right? Okay, despite the fact that we live in a speech community, there's lots of variation within the speech community. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying as every single person who's Cuban-American and born in Miami speaks just like Maria. because this depends on a whole range of social factors, including access to bilingual education, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, level of education, and so forth. So we've got lots, just like any language variety, Miami English varies. Let's get technical for a split second. We set forth measuring the vowels of Cuban-Americans. Okay, so we measured the vocalic production of Cuban-Americans and non-Latinos, and we compared them. So we looked at the vocalic productions for about 75 different Miami-born Cuban-Americans, and we found that for the most part, they're very similar to non-Latinos. So for vowels like this, the vowel aw as in coffee, Cubans and non-Latinos have the same production. However, Cubans differ from non-Latinos when you look at vowels like oo. Okay, here's the Cuban production is back here. This is the vowel mouth. Okay, so the Cuban production is back here, and they say things like boo, whereas non-Latinos say things like boot. Okay, so there's subtle differences, but these are differences that people recognize. Okay, and I'm not going to get too hung up on this thing, but there's all kinds of vocalic differences that we've quantified, and these end up being significant. Those are the women that we looked at. These are the men. It basically shows the same thing. We also said, you know, English and Spanish are very similar languages, actually, but they differ in some really important ways. One of the ways that they differ is that Spanish is spoken with what linguists call syllable timing. So almost every single syllable has the same duration, whereas English is stress-timed. Sometimes the syllables are really long, sometimes the syllables are really short, and it has to do with a whole bunch of linguistic questions that we're not going to talk about today. So one of the things that we've noticed in U.S. Latino communities is that Latinos speak English with a rhythmic timing that is kind of like Spanish. We measured that in Miami also, and we found that indeed Cuban-Americans are more Spanish-like in their prosodic rhythm of English than non-Latinos here, and that's a significant difference. What about words? The Miami English Lexicon. You all know this, right? You know, what words are unique to Miami? The first one's gonna have to be dale, right? Dale, pa, papo, papi. Okay, so you all know all of this stuff that infiltrates Miami English, but there's also a lot of expressions that are, okay, so borrowings, we can talk about Spanglish later if you want, but there's a lot of expressions in Miami English that are not borrowed, but rather calqued. Okay, so loan translated. And I started noticing these when I moved here from LA 5 years ago. LA has lots of Spanish speakers, but I never heard these expressions in English. Things like get down from the car. Okay, for get out of the car. Have you heard this? Okay, it's based on the Spanish bajar del carro. Put me the light. Okay, this kind of thing. Make the line. Okay, Miamians like to say make the line. Or invite you, from like the Spanish, te invito una cerveza. I invite you a beer. We hear these expressions all the time. The last one that I have up on here is meat for beef. So a meat empanada, right, instead of a beef empanada. So these types of expressions, what we did was we gave Cuban immigrants and Cuban-American, Miami-born Cubans, sentences in English, and we said translate these to English. And we find that they use these bars are the Cuban immigrant generation, and these darker bars are their children. And they end up using these expressions a lot. The kids use them less than the parents do, but what it tells us is that Cuban-American kids use some of these unique expressions, and they're not just disappearing with the immigrant generations. Then we said, okay, fine, so they do them in a production task, but how do they perceive of them? So we asked Miami-born Cubans to give us acceptability ratings for these expressions, things like get down from the car, make the line, married with, she got married with Antonio, this kind of thing. And then we asked 300 people from outside of Miami using Mechanical Turk, so an online social science software program, if what their ratings were. Okay, how do you perceive of these types of expressions? And across the board, with the exception of very few of them, Miamians say, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. Okay, the Miamians, what this bar graph shows, we don't have time to get into it, but the bar graph shows that Miamians perceive of local expressions as, for the most part, being normal or equivalent to the national standard. So they don't really see the difference between waited in line and made the line. Okay, whereas the national audience says, that sounds funny to us. the point is that we're sharing in a speech community, and we've got phonological things that we share, syntactic things that we share, and yes, lexical things. And finally, the point is that at each of these levels, there's influence from Spanish. So as I pivot, how am I doing? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll pivot to part 2, and we'll do this at warp speed. I want to talk to you about the way the Miami-born Cubans talk about language here. Okay, this is really the important part. Okay, language attitudes. Okay, so I want to go back to this slide that I put up at the beginning where I suggested to you that actually Miami we're like overly rich. The richness of our linguistic lives is like overdetermined. We've got, Miami-born Cubans have Spanglish, they have Spanish, they have English, they have lots of stylistic variation within each of those codes. They're really adept at moving into formal varieties and informal varieties, knowing when to code switch, when not to code switch. The richness of the linguistic scene in Miami is almost overwhelming to a linguist, okay? And yet, what's really interesting is that the linguistic richness is not only widely not recognized, but is oftentimes stigmatized. What I've learned from teaching at FIU for the past 5 years is that sometimes my students perceive of their Spanish as not good enough. They think of their Spanglish as bad or as bastardizing one language or the other, and sometimes they feel also insecure about their English. And it hurts my head because as a linguist, I see all of this richness and they perceive lots of stigma. Okay, so let's talk about some attitudes about Cuban Spanish in Miami. So we're going to get really, really real right now. Okay, we did sociolinguistic interviews with about, as I told you, 70 Cuban-Americans in Miami. And I just want to play you some of their talk about talk. Maybe this will work.
Spanish is probably spoken. People say not correctly, like it's mostly slang Spanish that you get from, I don't know, TV and stuff like that. Like, it's not correct Spanish because it's mostly the people that just recently arrived from that region. So it's not Spanish that I was used to growing up, but I've learned now all the slang words.
Okay, so what is Spanish in Miami? It's chusmo. It's not correct. It's not correct Spanish. And who speaks it that way? The people who just got here. Okay, have you heard these things? You've heard these things. Everybody should be going like this because everybody's heard these things if you live in Miami. Okay, attitudes on Cuban Spanish in Miami. Zoe, then she says, we're not going to deal with this. Zoe says, oh, well, the most proper Spanish is in Spain, in Madrid, in Barcelona, and stuff like that, because I guess they're more educated than the people in Cuba who are suffering under the dictatorship, I guess. Okay, so the quality, one of the ways in which Miami-born Cubans narrativize or explain normal linguistic differences to say it's the dictatorship. Okay, so Castro is to blame for this. Okay, and so how about in Cuba? Maybe I'll play you a bit of, oh, this is kind of long. Anyway, she says, on the island, I feel like people who are coming down now speak a lot of slang, speak really loud, and their Spanish is just like very Cuban. Okay. So attitudes on Cuban Spanish in Miami. This is another speaker. He says, you can even compare. You can see the difference with, for example, Cubans, because I see Cubans most often than not. And I would know because I am Cuban, so it's not like, it's not prejudiced. Okay? You can tell the difference between the other Cubans that come to Miami and the newer ones. Okay? So let's get real about that. Who came when and who's coming now? My grandparents speak it this way, I speak it that way, and the new people, they speak it that other way. Okay, really what we've got is just sociolinguistic variation, but then it's getting carved up according to attitudes. Okay, and they speak Spanish completely different. They talk with more swagger. Okay, in contrast to my parents who are old school Cuban. They left Cuba in 1981, so they're Spanish. ... Yeah, 81. It's not even 60. It's not even 65. You know what I mean? It's not even like 59. It's 81. Okay, so Spanglish in Miami. Okay, so then Spanglish. Okay, Jason, these are all pseudonyms, a Miami-born Cuban, says Spanglish is pretty much like the main language of Miami. It was pretty much the survival language, you know, the whole 59, you know, the 60s movement, which is still going on, actually. You know, right now it's not just so many different varieties of Spanish here. It's going to be like this kind of mismatch or whatever, so we're still kind of working it out. So Jason puts forth this kind of teleological view of language that really, in Miami, we're mismatched, it's kind of nasty, it's jabberwocky, but we're working it out, we're getting better with it. Okay, and then Jane says, it's like a lot of Cubans, like I noticed, that are half assimilated, but they're still trying to learn English. They'll make up words because they think you only speak one language, and that's like, so we can understand each other. I think also sometimes we just get lazy, okay? I won't ask you to raise your hand if you've called somebody's language lazy. Let's get real for one split second. Language can never be lazy. Language is just language. Code switching is normal. Spanglish is normal. Okay? Normal phenomenon. Not lazy. Okay? So we just say whatever occurs in our head and like, no, this is the language, we should keep them separately. You know what? If we want to keep the languages separately, do you know what we need in Miami? Comprehensive dual language immersion education in all schools. If you want people to speak only Spanish, then you got to teach them Spanish. Otherwise, they're going to mix them, which is a normal phenomenon. Okay, so here's somebody else. She says about her brother, I get really annoyed at my brother when he says stuff like lunciar. I'm like, it's almorzar. And I usually then call him a name. But I was like, it's almorzar. It's like, you sound like a dummy. Like, you were born in Cuba. I don't have that excuse. Or that, like, I speak Spanish better than you do. What's up with that? But I get annoyed just because you are mixing the languages. You're losing your Spanish as you're doing it. That's what I see. If you're making up words in English that sound like they're Spanish, but they're not really Spanish, you're losing your Spanish, which is not good. It's very necessary to know Spanish in Miami, and not to sound like a complete, like you're fumbling through it. Then no one is going to respect you. So let me just wrap this up with some conclusions about language ideologies, and this is a conversation that I think we need to be having at FIU and in Miami. Language ideologies are widespread beliefs about what language is or should be. Not necessarily about what language is for linguists, but personal beliefs about what you think language should be. So some language ideologies in the Cuban-American community that we've been identifying and writing about. Ideology of Generation Ism. Okay, so the idea that real Cuban Spanish came here in 1959, or 1960, or 61, or 1981, depending on whom you ask. And that each successive generation that comes thereafter, the Spanish is less real, it's less pure, it's less good. Okay? When we pause to consider the classed and racialized dimensions to waves of immigration from Cuba to Miami, those comments about Spanish serve as a proxy for talking about racial and class identities. So they're kind of problematic, actually. An ideology of monolingual languages, the belief that languages are naturally separate and should always be separate and distinct. Okay? But we know in situations of sustained language contact, people mix their languages. That's a very, very, very normal thing to do. We can have conversations about when it's appropriate to mix and when it's not appropriate to mix, but to vilify, vitiate, or demonize an entire community for mixing their language, not a good thing to do. Okay, and then finally, the ideology of personal responsibility suggests that, I didn't even show you the data because it's such a short talk, suggests that maintenance of non-English languages is the responsibility of individuals, not of the community or the society at large. So there's a lot of, for me, really heart-wrenching moments in my data when people say, Cuban-American youth say, I really wish that I spoke Spanish better, or I really wish I could speak with my siblings. I should be doing more. I should get Duolingo. I should get, download all of these tapes. I should be studying. Okay, I. And what's not on people's radar, and this is why we call it an ideology, is that the maintenance of the language is the responsibility of the community. Okay, not of just individuals. And what I've come to understand about my wonderful, fabulous FIU students is that many of them walk around with lots of shame about their Spanish, and they feel embarrassed a lot of times because they don't speak it well enough or whatever, and they believe that it's their fault. So the last conclusions. Listen, as from the perspective of a linguist, I think Cuban Americans have a lot to celebrate linguistically in Miami. on the island too maybe, but as a scholar of Miami, what's going on here is really remarkable. It's overly rich. However, damaging language ideologies about Miami and among Cuban Americans are limiting. And what they do is they point finger, in Miami there's a lot of finger pointing at each other. Like, okay, you're ruining Spanish because you're mixing it with English. And oh, I should be, I'm not passing it down in my family and it's my fault. Really, we should be pointing the fingers at the institutions who are not giving us access to bilingual education, language policy that promotes both languages and so forth. So my final point is that I think what we need are more conversations like this, greater awareness about language, bilingualism, bilingual education, and especially language ideologies here at FIU and in Miami. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, thank you for the Humanities and the Research Institute at FIU, Michael, and Jorge. Really thrilled to be here with colleagues whom I respect and admire. I am in the field of literary studies, so I'm hoping that my comments would complement what others have to say about the visual arts, linguistics, and music. I think it's very exciting that we're starting this conversation about second generation Cuban-Americans from different angles. I would like to contextualize the discussion by drawing some parallels between the literature of the second generation and the one that preceded it, the so-called 1.5 generation. Are they different? How? What is distinctive about the category of writers that have erupted in the literary scene in the past 15 years and who make up, the second generation? The 1.5 generation is composed of writers who left Cuba as children with young adults and who were educated for the most part in the U.S. Being at an equal distance between both worlds, such writers as Cristina Garcia, Atové, Pablo Medina, Vicente Suárez, Gustavo Pérez-Firmat, Carlos Eire, Ricardo Paullosa, Luz de Gil, Luz Béjar, Eliana Rivero, Elías Miguel Muñoz, and Roberto Fernández, to name a few. Write primarily in English, but also in Spanish. Sometimes they go back and forth. Roberto Fernández has published some novels in English, and then, the most recent novel is written in Spanish. And Gustavo Pérez-Firmat also goes back and forth. Second generation, on the other hand, writes almost exclusively in English or relies on linguistic borrowings, as other Latino and Latina writers do. The Cuban-American community appears sometimes in the background, sometimes at the forefront, as it does in Pérez-Firmat's memoir, Next Year in Cuba, Cubanos Coming of Age in America, published in 1996. But the emphasis in Miami is rare among the 1.5 generation writers. Having been raised far from the Cuban enclave in Miami, some like Garcia and Ovejas set their novels in more diverse ethnic communities. Other nationalities and ethnic groups are depicted in the works. These are writers who share a group identity, fueled in part by the anthologies that have nourished a sense of collective identity. And they're also very much aware of their diasporic condition, although they may still